Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Gibson, and today I am joined by someone who Eric Trexler speaks highly of, who we recently had on the show. That should have dropped before this episode is up, so you guys will have listened to that and know a lot more about creatine, caffeine, and citrulline. Um, but the start of that show, we had this little preamble about Buddhism, and Eric was kind of going on about how Eric Helms, the person who we have on today, is very kind of, I don't know, he just handles things really well. He's kind of like, you know, baseline, a really relaxed, thoughtful, um, I don't even know how to describe it, but you're kind of a level-headed guy, and he was kind of looking to work more towards that. And I thought I'd mention that to you and ask you, how do you maintain this kind of level-headed, rational approach? Um, is that something you were born with, or is it something you developed over time? Maybe you can give us the in on your secret to being a rational, level-headed person.
Well, first, I'm honored to hear that. I started out as someone who was heavily gatekeeping, against other Erics to enter the sphere, and eventually I just, said if I can't beat him, I'll join him, and partnered up with the guy from Mass. No, but in all seriousness, that's a tremendous compliment. I think Eric is also
Mm.
like that, and to some degrees, I would say uh, I think he does a better job of it than I do. I think there's also what I will say is I'm good at by the time I present something online, whether I type it,
Mm.
say it, or get it out of my system publicly, I think I'm very good at showing restraint,
Mm.
thinking through what I say, and presenting it in as balanced a way as I can, given my biases and my humanity. Um, and I think that is not necessarily something that's just inbred in me. What I
Mm.
do think is a very natural tendency I have is to work with others. So I tend to find myself always doing cooperative projects. Like my books have two other authors. Mass is not just me. It's not the Eric Helms research review. I didn't decide to do that. My website's not BioHelms. It's 3D Muscle Journey with like four other people, and then an extended universe of like eight of us. And I tend to be involved with a lot of collective efforts towards things. So because of that, I find myself representing more than just myself, which I
Mm.
think has been a really good tool to make sure that I am extra careful with honoring the people I work with and making sure I respect the diversity of viewpoints and ideas and backgrounds that I often find myself representing, which has only changed more or increased, I should say, becoming a research fellow with students at AUT in the last couple of years. So I think that's part of it. That said, I also definitely was raised in a way that probably promotes that. Um, my mother's a marriage and family therapist. I'm very close to my uncle, who is a psychologist. So, like effective communication
Mm.
and I don't know, probably some of my rational skepticism training as a scientist is kind of always lended itself towards that stuff. Being open to the idea that I don't have a monopoly on perspective. So yeah, I try to look at it from that way. But if you can find old bodybuilding.com forum posts of me going at it with people or Facebook stuff from like pre 2012. So I definitely have been worse, I guess,
Mm.
and I've never found it to be useful. I think you get that one moment of feeling self-righteous and justified, and it really kind of like you want to, pump your fist like, yeah, I won that. But it ultimately just kind of narrows your scope of who you can
Mm.
you can affect. And as I've become more and more focused on trying to help other people and make the community I'm a part of better, I've seen that as a downside, not an upside. So if I win an argument, but that person blocks me or something like that, that's kind of a loss, you know. So I've always tried to come at it from the perspective of does this help bridge gaps or does this help draw boundaries and lines? So that
Mm.
probably I think so. The social aspect I think is what helps me do it.
Yeah, I'm always a person who's looking for some sort of useful takeaway or some sort of recommendation that our listeners can use to help bolster their own um, uh, kind of similar approach to that, right? Because I think initially you're armed with information, or at least you frame it or see it that way, and then kind of on the flip side, once you've had that over time and start to understand the entirety of the field or the entirety of kind of where people's opinions lie about the topics, it starts to become more of an educational thing and less of an armed with information thing. So for people who are thinking, okay, I want to obviously impact the world in the best way that I can. I want to make sure this information is disseminated in a way that's effective and taken up, and not just kind of paraded around. Is it some resource they can be directed towards, or is it practice, just having conversations or arguments, or is there an effective way to expedite this? Or is it something, again, you kind of just pick up over time, because we have people on both ends of the extreme. So there's got to be some propensity either way to be one or the other. But again, you can kind of float along that spectrum.
Hmm.
But I think that's where the work comes in.
Yeah, there's a. It's funny you said being in more arguments. I recall this was like the 2005 equivalent of going on YouTube and having an inflammatory title and say prove that I'm wrong, and sitting there on video and arguing people like insert name of person destroys insert political ideology, right? And it's sometimes these people have like binders of arguments against the
Mhm.
things that are commonly said, and it's really the antithesis of communication.
Mhm.
You're listening to the person to see how you're going to counter them, rather than trying to educate them. So in the 2005 version of that was kind of like the wars we got into on the bodybuilding.com forums, or most forums, where we literally had little green reputation points, that the more
Mhm.
sciencey of a forum it was, you would primarily get those by like rap battling people with science, and I'm minus the rap. So it was like, who's got the better like PubMed
Mhm.
kung fu? And I was definitely, I would say I sharpened my sword in that.
Mhm.
But what I would often see is that we were winning battles and losing wars. So what I mean by that is that there was a time where the mere idea of not just having an 8 approved foods on the bodybuilding like list was laughed at and scrutinized, and like if you tried to bring up science, it was like, why don't you just pay attention to the IFBB pros? And this science was almost like a bad word at
Mhm.
that time point. And lab coats and geeks, and you don't know anything about being in the trenches, and all the tropes you hear that are a little more comical now, that we seem to be in a resurgence of interest in using science to further our performance. We were rife with it then. So I think that put us in a defensive position. I'm saying us as collectively people who are arguing the side of science at the time. So I definitely had my table and my chair and my binder of arguments against why you have to eat these certain foods to get shredded, and why tilapia thins the skin, and why cheese makes you look soft, or all that nonsense. And I was well practiced, well rehearsed, um, but I would rarely convince the person I was talking to change their ways, and I would often just make an enemy. So I started to think about, well, the whole facts over feelings crew,
Mhm.
not a great way to change the world. And you're not always right, because first you kind of have to be in a very arrogant space there, but you have to be to think that you have monopoly on the facts. Sometimes you do have the facts, the other person doesn't. But an educator approaches that very differently than someone who is sitting at one of those tables. Like an educator is going, um, I'm here to share knowledge to help others, and helping others isn't unsolicited advice or attacking them, without any kind of, like without being provoked. Like no one's
Mhm.
seeking help here. Uh, and I'm not talking about the times when you look at someone who is putting out information with a big platform, and then saying, "Hey, this is potentially harmful. Here's why." Challenging them publicly is kind of like a service to say, like, hold on, this is dangerous charlatan actions here. I'm talking about like somebody posts their diet on the forums
Mhm.
and they get shouted down by a bunch of eggheads, right? So those are two very different things. And I got away from that because I didn't think it was helpful to any degree. And when I did need to, or felt it would be beneficial to engage with someone who was lacking the knowledge and doing something that maybe even was harmful, but often unintentionally, I thought about how would I want to be talked to? What are the things that lead me to close off and not listen? Well, being publicly challenged often doesn't help. Being condescended to, having assumptions about my intentions, those things are very, very common, that are done, and that's a great way to turn someone off to science. So I think having more emotional intelligence and not just building your repertoire of knowledge, but actually building your human interaction skills, understanding why people react the way they do, how people develop beliefs, and getting better at understanding where someone is coming from, and then seeing if they're open to a discussion or learning more, and trying to basically always have the principle of charity, assume the best of
Mm.
the person, so that and come to them with genuine curiosity and desire to help, rather than trying to end zone dance on you sciencing them. That is, God, I couldn't put a number to it, but infinitely more, in my experience, effective at getting people to come around to science than approaching it the other way. So the answer, I know there's a long kind of rambling around that, is essentially that any degree that you improve your rational skepticism or your knowledge, which I see as two different things, one is kind of memorizing facts, and the other is learning to think through and reason things.
Mm.
Both are very important, but equally important, if not more important, if you want to be a science communicator or teacher or someone who puts out content that hopefully results in a change in our community's understanding of the topic, is that emotional intelligence piece. Because without it, it's going to be ineffectual at worst, and potentially just, like I said, kind of locking down the border at worst, or at best at worst. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I'm sure there are a lot of well-intentioned people who give out information or provide information that supports their position or another position, but the degree of how factual that is can vary. So, assuming we now know how to approach people and create a conversation and create something that's convincing and says, "Hey, here's your narrative. Let's substitute that with the thing we think is more correct or more right." That assumes we have the right information to begin with.
It
And
does.
I made a Facebook post on this because I thought it was interesting. There was someone who was talking about, and this might politicize the podcast a little bit. It was wearing masks, and he's like, "I'm not going to wear a mask," and he's like, "The science supports my position," and I'm like, "Well, that's so people who wear masks, they say the same thing. So science supports everyone at this point, and that can't be right. It's kind of like the Lake Wobegon effect. Everyone's above average here." So you have to have someone who's below average, someone who is average, and someone who's above to kind of create this like even spread. And assuming that science is directed or guided in a way that shows that one thing is superior to another, we can use that to support our position, but it can't support both.
Mm-hmm.
How do we come to that position where we know what the science is, or we can find the right information, the right evidence, if you will, to use to help inform others who are interested in knowing more, or knowing the right way to, say, diet or build muscle or lift weights, something along those lines, something in kind of the health and fitness and weightlifting, powerlifting sphere.
Well, shit, Joshua. I would love each of the conversations I have on this topic to start with the other person claiming that science supports their position, not mine. Because
Mm,
that's 90% of the work, is just
mhm,
getting them to acknowledge that scientific data and a hierarchy of evidence exist. And therefore, we can look to it to form our opinions. Because if someone came to me, we'll use the same mask example, and they said masks are just a proxy for government influence, and it's a slippery
mhm.
slope towards big medicine to control us, and we can't trust the scientific elite and the medical elite and the government because these facts they throw at us are actually propaganda. It's really hard to get to find an entry point there. And if you look at the stuff on conspiracy theories and how they kind of self-propagate, and once they're entrenched, it's very difficult to get away from them. That's a much harder conversation to have. But if someone shares a dissimilar belief that I have, and they believe
Mm.
it's founded on science, whew, we're off to the races. I think to bring it out of the political sphere, just to hopefully not lose you any more listeners, if we bring it to, I think a great example of this is the efficacy of the ketogenic diet
Mm.
and the problem of low carbohydrates. Gary Taubes did a great job of painting a narrative with a limited selection of data that was logically coherent, and he would connect the dots for you. And it wasn't a completely unbiased. I'm not even to state about the intentions behind it, whether they were or weren't there, but certainly they weren't a full scope of the existing data on carbohydrates and fat and the effects on body composition, weight loss, and the obesity epidemic. However, if I found someone who was an adherent to this philosophy based on exposure to that data, fantastic. Now I just start setting the groundwork of let's get on the same page. So one of the things that I like to establish is, all right, do we understand what different hierarchies of evidence are? So are we okay with a randomized controlled trial taking precedence over, say, observational data, taking precedence over, say, expert opinion and over personal experience and anecdotes? And not dismissing any of them, but understanding
Mm.
that cohesively they give us a picture of something. And if we get there, then I could start doing some things like, hey, check out these. I normally don't start with boom, like I'm just going to drop on you 10 RCTs or the best three metas and just walk away like all my boys knew I won the rap battle. Because if someone has a well-formed belief to where they're actually arguing with you about it using science, you typically need to start a little closer to where they're at. So they're confident in this. It's going to be difficult to walk them back, even if they do think they're scientifically minded. So the first step is just going, all right. So you seem very confident that this is the case. That low carb diets are always better for cases where fat loss is concerned. Uh, Here's one randomized controlled trial where that didn't happen. What do you think of that? And they will typically, attack the methods. That's probably what's going to happen. They'll find a limitation of the study. Fair enough. Here's another one. And once they've attacked the methods of multiple studies, you then have an opportunity to go, all right,
Mm.
those are all fair critiques. Do they apply to the data that you're looking at? And often they do. And if you can get them to realize without throwing it in their face and acting like, haha, got you, and just pointing out that, hey, we're both human, that you're not applying the same level of scientific rigor to data that does or doesn't fit your bias. And you can admit there that, oh, I have a bias too. I understand that, that's all good. But let's try to get consistent. And then let's take an objective look at the data. You're on your way. Now, that might be a multi-month conversation. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think people who are trying to win a public argument on social media with someone in a matter of hours or minutes, it's just not going to go well.
Mm.
You leave people with social pressures to try to double down and keep fitting that narrative, and it doesn't normally go anywhere. So I think you really do need like true consent on both sides. Like, so hey, I'd be happy to engage with you on this. Probably don't have a whole lot of time today. Do you want to take it to DMs? And also, do you have time for this? Like, are you interested in us kind of going down this rabbit hole? And I'm open to being wrong. Are you? If you can get that, and then you can bring it forward, if data actually is on your side, um, you have a very good chance of them shifting their position. It may not fully shift in one day because we're humans, but at the very least, I think I honestly like at least double-digit numbers of times I've done exactly this on exactly this topic, and I've taken a science-interested person who might be pigeonholed as a keto zealot to
Mm.
becoming a little more agnostic. Like, hey,
Mm.
now I'm saying that carbohydrate-based diets certainly can work for fat loss, but with the folks I've worked with myself and my personal preferences, they seem a lot easier when you go low carb, and that's a huge win because now all of a sudden they have a nuanced opinion, and they have basically opened a door, and the data is much more likely to have a more balanced impact on them when they come across it in the future. And you can never close that door again. Like, I mean, I've
Mm.
literally seen people who are so bought in that they're like, it's impossible to lose fat effectively on a moderate or high carb diet. And I'm like, well, here are some bodybuilders, you know. So and that's also an important point too. Is some people who aren't necessarily onto it with science because some of what Gary Tobbs did, unfortunately, is, he would like attack Ansel Keys and some of the medical establishment, and there's this kind of
Mm.
conspiratorial element to it. It's the big food pyramid kind of thing. So sometimes with people who are a little more conspiracy theory esque, you have to start with, okay, well, what disproves this hardcore belief just anecdotally? What can't be true if
Mm.
this was true? So if it is all about insulin, there shouldn't be all these natural bodybuilders who can diet on 200 to 300 grams of carbs and 40 grams of fat and get shredded and be world champions. There are, and also I like to throw them a bone with those anecdotes. By the way, here's a person who does a low carb diet and is also a champion. They're both up there. So this is viable. And then they'll typically goalpost shift. What used to be, it's impossible to lose body fat unless you're in a low carb diet, now becomes, well, if you're metabolically dysregulated, and if we're talking about the obesity epidemic and the general population, now it's not. But if you are an athlete, or if you have these, if you're genetically, gifted to be a carbohydrate responder, then you can use a moderate carb diet. And some people would be like, goalpost shift, screw you, and let me burn this bridge real quick and make you close minded. Every goalpost shift away from an incorrect position is closer to being correct. And I think you have to see
Mm.
that as a win when you're on the other side. And the fact that you have just got that person, even though they're trying not to quote unquote lose, if it's not about winning and losing and they shift the goalpost, that is essentially a tangible change in their mentality that, because of exposure to data that you were a part of, you helped them, whether they realize it or not. So I think a lot of it is kind of reframing on your own side of it when you're in one of these positions.
Yeah, I think that's an incredible explanation or kind of detailed analysis of the approach that should be taken or could be taken to help people who are in two different positions kind of meet towards the more correct understanding of the topic. And you just happen to choose low carb dieting or a keto diet, which reflects the topic of this podcast incredibly well. So I don't know if you intentionally planned that or not, but that's like expert podcasting on your end. So the show is about body composition, and I guess how this will kind of bear out during the course of our conversation, whether we take it down the weight class route or more down kind of the ins and outs of like the physiology of gaining and losing weight and the the difficulties of that. Like, who knows, right? That's kind of the fun of it. But I did think it would be useful to have a show where we discuss a couple critical concepts, things you hear thrown around, and I wanted kind of on my end an update on where we stand with these concepts. So I mentioned to you the set point theory off air, and kind of interested to hear your take on that. But as we start, I think it's important to differentiate between two concepts that might be used they might kind of be used um, equally and maybe in different ways, but body weight and body composition, what the difference is between the two, and then we can kind of go into the more nuanced side of things with each.
Love it. Yeah, let me know where you want to start and we can kick it off.
Yeah, so what exactly is the difference, and I guess we could go into body composition. So what would uh create the concept of someone's body composition, just generally?
Sure. Yeah. So body composition is just what makes up all of your mass, right? And there are in research multiple ways to measure this. There's the ones people are most familiar with, like your classic two compartment models, where we measure your percentage body fat and everything else. That's a good representation of your classic two compartment model. If you have one of those, scales where you step on it and it spits out your body fat percentage, or it spits out your lean mass and your fat mass. Some of them, because it is using bioelectrical impedance, can also tell you an estimation of your body water. So that's like a three compartment model. But you can break the compartments down into many. You can get it all the way down to the individual, like the molecular level, if you want. But
Hmm.
I think most people, when they talk about body composition, are thinking about the different things that contribute to our body mass. So um, you will often hear, especially big lifters, critique BMI, right?
Hmm.
So body mass index is just a function of your mass relative to your height, and the classification of obesity or overweight is when you go over 25 and then over 30. respectively. Um, so if you have a lot of body mass from muscle mass, if you've been lifting weights as a sport or as a hobby, and you've been doing that long enough, it's quite likely that even at a very healthy body fat level, that your BMI will still be in a category that is considered unhealthy, despite the fact that what BMI is trying to represent is a level of adiposity that is typically associated with negative health outcomes, right? So, you could be the person who, and I experienced this when I was in the military. Um, Depending on which branch of the military you're in, they may or may not. And again, I haven't been in the military for over a decade now. They may look at waist circumference. They may look at just at body weight, and you might be fit and you might be muscular, but you might get categorized as being, not within regulations. Similarly, you might just go to the doctor and you lift weights and they weigh you. And this is probably not as common these days, but it wasn't too common a decade or two ago, and get told, oh, we need to bring that body weight down. And that may not be true, if you're someone who's, in fact, it's not true if you're at a healthy body composition. So it's an important distinction, especially for athletes, because, it can tell you something about your health that wouldn't be true if you did not lift weights. Likewise, if you are a strength athlete, you are more likely to have better performance when you have more muscle mass. So when we talk about dropping a weight class, that is ideally done without losing muscle mass, because that would mean a greater preservation of strength typically. And when you look at weight classes in powerlifting or weightlifting, there's a very clear trend of the higher the weight class, the stronger you are. And that's unless we accept that adipose tissue has not yet discovered contractile elements to it, which would be amazing. That is probably due to having greater amounts of lean body mass at higher body weights. But you can't really know on an individual level to what degree your body composition is made up of adipose tissue and lean body mass, which is everything else, without some measurement of body composition.
Okay, and then having established what body composition is, um, how you would want to change it, what typically goes into someone's already established body composition or body? So I won't even say body weight, but body composition. So say we have someone who is a certain body fat percentage, they have fat-free mass, fat mass, and all of the other fun stuff. Um, what goes into uh, that body composition at that moment in time? So I guess just to kind of prime you a little bit for this answer, I'm thinking training can influence it, diet, obviously, and then I kind of want to get into how you can manipulate those things to cause a change in body composition that would be preferable to the sport.
Sure. Yeah, and this might be a nice dovetail into like a settling point, right?
Hmm.
Um, so certainly, your genetics and your environment and your habits are basically the three things that kind of go into it. And in habits, I include like, do you regularly pick up heavy things,
Hmm.
and then try to put them over your head? Um, do you enjoy a certain type of food than others? How were you raised? Do you live in a city where it's impossible to walk anywhere?
Hmm.
All these things. So I think so. Settling point is kind of the idea that each person has an inbuilt body composition that they will hang out in if all else is equal. And when you look at animal research, this is absolutely true. Like if you look at uh, animals in the wild or in captivity, they will have a body weight that they defend quite well, and it is closely linked to body composition. And some of the attacks on the more hardcore, um, like settling point theory, is that it's kind of from the perspective like humans aren't animals, but we 100%
Hmm.
are. It's just that we manipulate our environment a lot more than animals. So, and we think about things in different ways. So the human experience, animals have an animal experience, right? We have much more societal influences on our human experience that can then have effects on what we do and how we and the way that our environment, genetics, and habits interact to result in a place where we settle.
Hmm.
So I think if we were to be like, yep, genetic set point, it's just right there. I know you notice I've been using the word term settling point, which I think is more accurate,
Mhm.
but the term
Mhm.
set point would imply that it doesn't matter what happens anywhere, we're always going to be at this body weight, and any
Mm.
changes are temporary, right? We know that is objectively false because we have seen, body weights and body compositions go higher and become more dominated by adipose tissue for the last, since the 70s. Basically, it's been a steady climb. That's tapered off a little bit in certain places and accelerated more at certain times. So we know that by manipulating our environment, we are overcoming what is thought to be a set point.
Mm.
But that doesn't necessarily invalidate set point theory. Like if you take an animal and put it in captivity and you restrict its movement and you feed it different chow, it will also gain weight and become obese. So we just have to think that, we're not necessarily um, rats in cages, but we are absolutely in a very different environment than we have been if you go multiple decades back, or especially if you go hundreds or thousands of years back. So settling point theory kind of acknowledges that all of those things are all contributing, and that so I think it is accurate that people do have a point where they defend. How well that defense acts in the face of our environment, we have seen the limits of, but it definitely is different on an individual basis. Um, and it is much more than math. It's highly complex.
Mm.
It's not just simply a matter of, well, if you're more active and you exercise, you burn more calories, so you won't gain weight. There are effects of certain levels of activity on hunger regulation, and so being more sedentary can dysregulate your hunger. Um, and being in an environment where you're exposed to a lot more external food cues
Mm.
can overcome your sense of being full or hungry, so that it is more challenging to eat quote unquote normally, so that it doesn't result in a net energy surplus and slow weight gain over time. So I would say the basic concept of settling point is it's the way it is. It's easily observable. Um, what the exact mechanisms are is definitely something that people debate or are trying to figure out. But I think more importantly is, what do we have agency to manipulate, and
Mm.
how should we orient ourselves if we want to manipulate body composition or body weight. And it's a very different answer if we're talking about doing that for sport, like making weight.
Mm.
And it's a very different answer if we're talking about dealing with the general population and health. So, yeah, I don't know if that's a good entry point for you to ask more questions or not.
Yeah, definitely. It was really interesting, and a really well-rounded answer. Coming off the tail end of that, it seems like, and given kind of the advantage of over consuming and over storing energy, that that settling point would want to be as high as possible. I guess if I could talk about it like that, you're surrounded by a surplus of food. You would want to consume as much as possible, again, to have as much energy available in case something were to happen and you didn't have access to food. So why do you like, could you posit like why that exists in the first place? um like what would cause that to exist from like a genetic standpoint? I mean, like, is that an interesting question to kind of to speculate on?
Sure, yeah, and there's been a lot of people who've kind of taken a, I guess an evolutionary biology perspective on this. Um, and if you look at humans generally, we're much better at defending weight loss than weight gain.
Mhm.
And I think if you look at the history of selection pressures on humans, you could argue that famine and periods of not having access to food is a much more uh, likely threat to the species than things that come from being high in body
Mm.
fat. There are downsides to being too high in body fat. In fact, some of the reasons why, say, mice are not a great proxy for humans is that predation is something that they've had to deal with for much longer. So, a mouse that is carrying extra weight and is therefore moving slower is at
Mm.
arguably equal, if not higher, risk of dying than a mouse that is starved, right?
Mm.
So some of the animal models we have that seem to have a more symmetrical ability to defend body weight um, in both directions, both in overfeeding and underfeeding. It makes sense when you think about it from that perspective. While humans haven't had the same pressures from predation historically, going back into kind of our evolutionary biology. And this is, again, me reading other people's stuff and just parroting it. I'm not an evolutionary biologist by any means, but certainly it is a very, very modern problem that the health consequences of excess and constant access to energy and less movement. And it's unfortunately not a problem that is actually threatening our ability to pass on our genetic material. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if there's a greater likelihood that by the time you're in your 40s, you're 10 kilos heavier today than you would have been in 1950, you're still going to have kids. So not too much of a threat there. Um, so I think that's a big part of it, obviously, and there is also some benefits from being slightly higher in body fat. Like you said, it does protect against a famine coming. There is also some data to suggest that people who are slightly higher in body fat are more likely to survive like widespread disease,
Mm.
which can also interact with famine as well. So there may have been time periods where that was the case. And if you look through not so recent history, um, like these days, we know that lower socioeconomic status typically is a contributor to a greater likelihood or risk of obesity and health cost. However, if we were to go back to, like, say, feudal periods, pre-industrial periods, being overweight was a sign of being rich.
Mm.
So it just depends on the social and societal structure and context that we're talking about, to where we can see those differences manifest. But essentially, humans are much less threatened by being overweight than they are by being underweight. If we kind of take a bird's eye view of our timeline of existence as a species, which is probably why we have this unbalanced compensatory ability. So,
Mm.
like, if you look at the metabolic adaptation, quote unquote, it goes both directions. Certainly, in overfeeding, people's energy expenditure goes up and sometimes beyond what would be predicted by their body weight. But it is a much less consistent finding, and the magnitude's typically lower on average compared to how much it can downgrade in response to underfeeding and weight loss. So, and then you can even categorize people based on how thrifty or spendthrift they are in terms of activity compensation. And there are also people who have different satiety and hunger responses to these things. And then you layer all that on top of societal changes and how you grew up, and epigenetics. We're kind of, we said genetics, but basically what I'm basically like, that's a catch-all for stuff that's built in, but there's a whole bunch of other things, like how things impact you in the womb and at a young age,
Mm.
and then what goes on later in life can have effects that I think the average consumer of fitness science information might lump together as genetics, but that aren't strictly genetics. So it is relatively complex, um, but there is a fair amount we can manipulate. That's for sure. And I mean, everyone who's listening is presumably someone who lifts weights, and that's one of the biggest things out there, obviously. But there are more things that can go into that for sure.
Yeah, and before we actually start talking about altering body composition from either end, so I just had a conversation and recorded a podcast with Fernando Reis, which is a super heavyweight a weightlifter, very successful world medalist, great guy.
Powerful
Yeah,
being.
very strong guy. You guys can check out that episode if you haven't already listened to it. And then someone on the other end, we have Amyan Chol, who's like a 50 something kilo weightlifter, incredibly tiny, incredibly muscular, very low body fat. And Fernando mentioned having a really, really hard time gaining weight. He said he gets around 155, and going much beyond that was incredibly difficult. And I'm assuming Amyan Chol has a hard time losing weight if he wanted to do that. If he said, hey, if there's another weight class, if they'll invent one just for me, it's going to be difficult to move down. What are the changes that happen with weight gain and weight loss that prevent further loss or further gain? And I guess from Fernando's standpoint, why would it be more resistant to putting on more mass, right? In theory, if he could be Lasha, he'd probably be stronger. And given he talked about being slower and maybe technical changes, but it's a struggle to eat enough and put on more weight. So why would that be starting from the top end? Um, Something that's almost defended against.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it is worth pointing out that we're talking about a guy who's struggling to get over 155, right?
Right,
So
right.
for our American listeners, that's someone who's like, man, getting into the mid 300 pounds is a big challenge for me. Um, it's a challenge for most people. There aren't that many people who are
Mm,
that big, even at his height, even with weightlifting. I'm 6 foot, and I've been weightlifting to get bigger. I'm never going to be 155. There is for me, getting over 100 kilos feels like I can't imagine how I ever liked eating before. Like, and the only way it's even possible is by me focusing on like the most indulgent, not
mm.
even just calorie bombs, but foods that I almost feel like you have a second stomach for, like chocolate chip cookies. Like, oh yeah, I mean that doesn't count. I could eat that anytime, right? It's like pizza and cookies and all the things that are lowest on the satiety index. Foods you
Mm,
eat and make you hungrier. The whole concept of you can't just eat one. So I will say that while he states that he has a tough time gaining weight,
mhm,
um, that's at a certain point, right?
mm,
So we're starting to see the upper threshold for that person. Other
mhm,
people like me, it's a lot lower. And some of the mechanisms that are actually going on, we often like to focus on the quote unquote metabolic adaptations, which I think are more
mm,
accurately termed, adaptive thermogenesis if you're a geek, or if you just want to be precise but not jargoned, energy expenditure
mm,
adaptations, which is basically means that the predicted energy expenditure you should have for your body weight is lower or higher than predicted by a certain degree when we look at research on it. Um, and the things that are actually going on, first, anytime you eat more, there's an increase in the thermic effect of food, which is roughly 10% of however much you eat. So if you are eating 3,000 calories to maintain weight, there is 300 kcals of your energy expenditure coming from just eating that food. And if you try to go up to 3,500, and you're like, all right, I'm gonna gain weight. Now it's another 50 calories, right? So it makes it a little bit harder. That's a very small component to it. Um, Often people, the reason why I don't like the term metabolic adaptation is because it makes you think of the component of TDEE, total daily energy expenditure, of resting metabolic rate or basal metabolic rate. And that does change to some degree, but it's not much. We're talking like
mm,
5 to 10% at most. However, a smaller contributor to our total daily energy expenditure is what's known as non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or NEAT. And this is all energy expenditure that is not associated with your basal metabolic rate or exercise. So this includes both conscious and subconscious physical activity, which is a pretty broad net. And you could break it down even further into subconscious, conscious, or non-resting energy expenditure. There's a bunch of different ways to classify it, but essentially, NEAT just means me moving my arms right now. For those who are watching on YouTube, like that kind of fidgeting or talking with my hands, to actually consciously getting up and walking to the store, to tapping my foot and not even realizing it, bobbing my head to music, how slouched I am, and all energy expenditure that's not when I go, sweet, it's time to go train. So NEAT, although it is not as large of a component of TDEE in people who are not like manual laborers or professional athletes, um, that's actually sorry. Energy expenditure, conscious energy expenditure in professional athletes or manual laborers can be higher than BMR, but most of the time,
mhm,
especially with strength athletes who don't burn that many calories from training, BMR is the largest component, but it's not the most adaptable. Like I said, 5 to 10%. The most adaptable components is actually NEAT. So when you see people who are defending a body weight up or down,
mm,
you will typically see a very large uptick in non-exercise activity thermogenesis or a downregulation in it. Um, that is kind of what's going on the energy outside of the equation, but that's not the hardest part. Most people, what they struggle with is not the sheer volume of food, it's how much they do or don't want to eat that volume of
mm,
food. So there are massive changes in leptin and ghrelin and other, basically just a catch-all satiety and hunger regulation and hormones, that, anyone who has dropped a significant amount of weight and gotten very lean, their baseline amount of how much they want to eat is enough to make them gain weight. Likewise, as I said, when I get over 100 kilograms, I have no desire to ever touch food, so I am always full and I don't have hunger. There are times when I could eat, but I'd prefer not to, almost at a certain point. So your baseline level of how much you want to eat is enough that you would lose weight. And those are just simple changes in the hormone environment related to satiety and hunger that occur. However, there are other things that can regulate or dysregulate that environment. So one of the things that seems to be most related to successful maintenance of weight loss is actually having higher levels of baseline activity. So there was there's some data that secondary analyses of data that came out in 2009, 2012 out of University of Colorado, where they looked at individuals who are lean, individuals with obesity, or individuals who are formerly obese and are now have successfully maintained weight loss of at least something like, I want to say 30 pounds for at least a year. But on average, we're talking about maintaining 40 pounds of loss for like 5+ years. So true successful weight loss maintainers. And the finding that is most consistent is that these individuals who are maintaining weight loss are 1 hour less sedentary per day, doing half an hour more of moderate to vigorous physical activity per day, and an hour more of light physical activity per day compared to those who are currently with obesity. So what's going on there? Is it just math? No, probably not. Because another interesting finding from the same data set is that they're still mistracking calories. They're still underreporting their calorie intake. So it's not just a math equation going on their head. There may be to some degree, but what is actually happening is better appetite regulation. So it does seem that there is a baseline level of activity that is seen as quote unquote physiologically normal for our appetite to be regulated properly and to have metabolic health. And I could go off on a huge tangent here, so you definitely cut me off if I'm getting too sideways to this topic. But exercise provides not only the benefits like we all care about, like getting stronger and getting bigger, but it also metabolically regulates our response to feeding. So there's a number of cool series of studies that have been done where they give someone they have them come in at night and they do a run, right? So they get on the treadmill, run for an hour at a pretty high intensity. And the next morning, they feed them a challenge meal, so a metabolic challenge meal. So this is typically a high carb, high glucose, and or high fat, high triglyceride meal. And they look at how long does it take for them to clear at a normal quote unquote rate, glucose and triglycerides out of the blood and sequester that into tissue. So here's the difference. What they do in these studies, they give these two groups the same challenge meal and that same exercise the night before, but in one group, they will give them a week of being sedentary, so spending 13 to 14 hours per day sitting on their butt or keeping their step count, say, around 2,000 to 3,000. And in the groups that are sedentary, that exercise does not have the metabolic benefits. They might, it might improve their VO2 max, they might get bigger, they might get stronger, but what we don't see is that metabolic benefit. So the metabolic benefits of exercise are blunted in someone who is highly sedentary, which tells us something, And if we look at in American football, which is arguably a strength and power sport as well, especially in the position that we're going to talk about, linemen who are purposely trying to gain weight and get big, about 50% of them have like pre-diabetes. Essentially, they're metabolically unhealthy, despite the fact that they're exercising and highly active. So there's a lot of contributing factors to what goes on in terms of what regulates satiety, what regulates metabolic health, and those are closely linked. So when you do more exercise, you burn more calories, but when you do more exercise, you better regulate your satiety response to eating and your normal baseline hunger signaling, and they become much more tightly regulated. There's a classic study on Bengalese mill workers that shows this, and it's what's called the J-shaped curve of energy intake and energy expenditure. And they had the office workers at the factory compared to all the different positions that basically went from a sedentary job to a lightly, moderately, and highly active job. And the moderately or highly active, I can't quite remember, had the same calorie intake as the sedentary individuals. But the body weight was the same in the lightly, moderately, and highly active individuals. They were just
Mm,
eating more and maintaining the same body weight. So their energy balance was regulated with a sufficient level of activity,
mm,
and they were therefore weight stable. However, the office workers who were sedentary and higher in body weight were overeating based on their
mm.
energy expenditure because it was not regulated. So that's all to say that having an appropriate amount of not even necessarily exercise, but activity in one's daily life can change completely whether or not they would be higher or lower in body fat and dysregulated and possibly have metabolic health consequences. So we often focus on like, what do I need to do to manipulate my nutrition? But a lot of the non-conscious math, at least, changes uh, are probably linked to how active we are.
That's interesting because I have heard recently a couple times that physical activity plays such a small part in influencing uh, how many calories you burn. I guess if it was framed like that, that it's not worth worrying about. But what I'm hearing from you is maybe including some sort of physical activity, even though it might not change the energy balance or the effect of that. It does a lot of other stuff under the hood. Is
Yes.
this like a general recommendation or something you have a conversation with when you are talking to, say, a strength athlete or a physique athlete or someone who one wants to eat, a decent amount of food and maintain a favorable body composition?
It is absolutely, and I think the that view that you've normally heard that the what happens with physical activity it doesn't isn't enough to budge the needle. It's a very myopic view that isn't really. I think it's overly reductionist, right?
Mm.
Because if you look like there's another way to frame that Bengali mill data, right? Oh, you eat more, like you get more active, you just eat more, and you don't lose weight, so it's pointless, you know. And but the problem is that not gaining weight is a huge
Mm.
win in our current society, and also it comes with these metabolic health benefits.
Mm.
Once you're actually at energy balance and active, that higher flux state seems much more associated with healthier outcomes and better metabolic health. So it is I think it's an overly reductionist view of exercise to think of it as just a calories in versus calories out math
Mm.
equation. Um, because the amount, like on average, if you look at like the U.S. and westernized countries, the amount of people who are like the size of the surplus to result in this slow, steady weight gain over someone's life is like single digit calories per year, and most of it
Mm.
is accumulated towards the holidays. So we don't need that much to actually arrest that or even start pushing it the other direction. Back in, I want to say it was like '09 or 2012, I can't remember, but there was a British Journal of Sports Medicine article that got like telephoned into the media that was basically the headline was exercise is pointless because they had this big study where they gave people this exercise and they only like lost half a kilogram or maybe they gained half a kilogram, but it's basically a bunch of exercise and no change. But it was a short-term study, and it's not necessarily like these studies are done where they just have people do 3 days a week of running for an hour and then see what happens with no nutrition intervention. And the fact that sometimes they lose a little bit of weight or that they stop gaining weight actually has huge potential implications long term. But yeah, to bring it back to the topic at hand, since this isn't about curing the obesity epidemic, if we're talking about weightlifters, there's a number of things. So weightlifters or powerlifters who are struggling to actually make weight regularly
Mm.
and be at a body composition and therefore body weight that allows them to get into making their weight without sacrificing strength. So let's say they're hanging out no more than say 5% over their weight class, and that's just kind of where they can settle and train instead of living in this constantly restricted state. Sometimes I look at, okay, well, how active are you? Because this is
Mm.
a problem for athletes as well. I think it's easy for people who lift to go, right, but I'm active, right? Like that's not me. But sedentary activity and exercise activity operate independently. They don't directly cancel each other out. And we have meta-analytic data to show this. That if you break people up into tertiles, so thirds of the most moderate to vigorous physical activity, the middle moderate to vigorous physical activity, and the lowest, and you do the same thing with sedentariness, that there are independent negative effects from being highly sedentary, the highest tertile of sedentary time. And there was a recent study I just reviewed in Mass where they took a bunch of athletes from a bunch of different backgrounds in sports, and they surveyed them, and they did their body composition. And they found that, and these are training athletes of multiple different sports, that the athletes with the highest reported amounts of screen time and overall sedentary behavior tended to have higher body fat. And they could actually run a regression to see that there was a small influence of the more time being spent sedentary per day on their body composition going the wrong way. So if you are someone who basically sits in front of a computer all day and then lifts 4 to 6 days a week for an hour, it's definitely better than not lifting 4 to 6 hours per week or whatever it is. But that sedentary behavior is doing some things you probably don't want, like dysregulating your ability to sense satiety and hunger as well. Not getting the best fat storage patterns. Probably you might have more ectopic or visceral fat, which is linked to some of these things that we don't like. So yeah, the conversation with someone who could possibly be lifting but is actually really, really sedentary outside of it is, well, let's actually just turn on your cell phone step count and let's see where you're at. Because it doesn't take much when we start to actually look at the data on what does it take, how many steps does it take before that challenge meal does get sequestered properly. You don't have to be like a marathon runner. We're talking about getting up to like 7,000, 8,000 steps per day. That's not even that random number of 10,000 that people recommend. Most people, if they have a sedentary job and they lift weights in the same day, like if you're sedentary all day and you go lift weights, depending on your height, you'll probably have a step count between 3,000 to 4,000 calories, 3,000 to 4,000 steps that day. Getting up to 7 is just a matter of then also taking 2 30-minute walks on top of that. So you can have a daily practice of waking up, going on a walk, coming home, sitting down at the desk all day, getting up, training, and then before you go to bed, go on a 30-minute walk. And you know what you can do on these walks, folks? You can listen to this podcast. It's a great way to catch up on past episodes. So it's not that hard to get into this, what I would call like not sedentary step count that seems to reduce the risk of all-cause mortality, that seems to eliminate that whole effect of losing the metabolic benefits of exercise. So it's a relatively low bar. I think most people think they have to live in the gym to get that. Weightlifters, they don't necessarily have that same misconception. But if you can take a look at an athlete and go, oh, you train 6-8 days a week sometimes, for high-level weightlifters, but outside of that, you're actually quite sedentary, you can do some interventions there to can make a pretty big difference in certain cases.
Yeah, this has been fantastic, and to hone in even more on what I think people who are listening will be interested in. And a quick anecdote for myself: a lot of the information I've picked up along the way about nutrition and how to favorably alter your body composition is through stuff like this. So I think it's important that we maybe provide some sort of practical recommendations for what we will discuss next, which is how to lose weight, put on muscle, which is what most people want to do. And then also an interesting kind of aside from that would be how to maintain or prevent too much regain over time, because it's something I also hear, and maybe I can get your take on it before we cover this, is the difficulty of maintaining weight loss, and how it's kind of a fruitless endeavor to diet. I think that's like a common trope you hear, and it depends on the person, right? But that's kind of the thing, that you shouldn't intentionally try to lose weight because it's not going to stabilize and maintain itself over time. What's your like general approach to kind of answering that question or discussing that topic?
I think there's some really good points that exist there. I think it can be taken too far and become fatalistic, but I think it kind of touches on everything we already spoke about, in that if you just diet, I actually think, and actually my colleague Dr. Ben House said this, that it is probably at this stage, based on what we know, if you're informed, it's unethical to give someone a diet without actually trying to get them to regularly exercise. Because all it's going to do is drive up their hunger, potentially give them an eating disorder, and then they will regain that, because their environment hasn't changed. All the things that we
Mhm.
talked about that go into your quote unquote settling point. Like if someone does want to lose weight and keep it off, we're talking about altering their settling point. So we're not changing their quote unquote genetics, which I basically said is a catch all for everything you can't change. But we do need to change someone's environment and their habits. So what the fitness industry is typically focused on is, well, how do we lose weight? And there's no question, diets work. So I hate the trope that diets don't work, because a lot of people don't necessarily have goals, people who listen to this podcast, of permanently losing that weight. Like if, let's say you compete in the 85 kilo class and you normally walk around at 89, your goal is to get to 85 on Saturday. And
Mhm.
then after that, you probably are in, you're not in any rush, but you're going to get back up to 89 pretty quick, because that's where you train best. That's where your settling point currently is. That's where you can get stronger. And then you're manipulating body composition and probably body water as well, which is part of body composition, of course, to make weight again. So it is cyclical for you on purpose. Same thing is true of competitive bodybuilding, just to a greater degree, you know.
Mhm.
Um, so the idea that you need to be able to maintain that weight loss is only conditionally important. For athletes, for weight class restricted athletes, you essentially need to have a healthy relationship with food and your body, and the ability to make weight without it harming your psychology or harming your performance, right? And that means, what's a reasonable striking range, and what habits do I need to hang out there? Um, that said, there's also a lot of athletes who, they got into the sport while they were also much heavier than they wanted to be. So this is maybe a side question for or related to health. So I think, to answer your question, um, anytime someone wants to permanently lose weight, essentially maintain lost weight, they really have to think about everything in their mind needs to be geared towards changing their environment and changing their
Mhm.
habits. Um, because if you lose weight, but those things don't change, it is just a matter of time. Anything that requires constant restraint or that is unsustainable, I don't care how much willpower you have, because if it was all about willpower, the best bodybuilders, like, oh, well, I've won the world championship, I'm just not going to get out of stage shape. So I'm just going to hang out here. I've already proven that I'm the best. I'm not going to have an off season. It would be easiest, and I have this iron will to just stay here. That's not what happens, right? So I think we know that whether it happens tomorrow or in 3 years, you're going to start regaining that weight if there isn't an environment where it doesn't take restraint to maintain what you've lost. So the whole kind of mantra of willpower and just work harder and all this stuff is great advice for when you're in an active weight loss phase. Don't get me wrong. I'm a competitive bodybuilder. There are times where I feel terrible and the only thing left to do is keep going or quit. And I do have to push myself and do that. But I don't walk around in stage condition all the time. And that's for a sport. That's not for someone who is trying to permanently alter their life. So I think the best tools we have, and there's some data to back this up. For example, if you look at the National Weight Loss Registry, and this is kind of case in point, a little bit less than 30% of them count calories.
Mhm.
However, a little bit less than 70% of them have instituted regular exercise and higher levels of activity. And when you look at what typically correlates with successful weight loss, it always goes back to, or at least one of the things that always jumps out of the data is they're more active. They have made a movement practice and being less sedentary and more active a regular part of their life. So I think for any weightlifters who are also like a CrossFit coach, or work as a personal trainer in a general population, and you want to work with your clients, yeah, it's great. Get them exposed to lifting, because that's what we love and we know all the benefits, and it's great for bone density and fall prevention and muscle mass and all that wonderful stuff, and bragging and then getting called not natty, all this fun stuff we deal with. But I think you want to expose your clients and the people you work with to a bunch of different types of exercise,
Mhm.
because the thing that's going to make the largest impact on them for their life is going to be finding a movement practice that they enjoy, that is fun. This is a bit of a tangent, but I remember as a personal trainer, I would often have my clients be like, "Oh, I'm so impressed at your willpower," and I would try to explain to them, "This is not willpower. I lift weights because I love it. You
Mhm.
hate lifting weights. So that's why you're paying to come here to have me make you lift weights. That's not sustainable. It's not sustainable. It's not a good financial decision. What we need to find is something that you love, or at least enjoy or like or can tolerate in the minimum dose if it's just tolerating to do it, so that you stay healthy and you can regulate the things that we're trying to regulate. But ideally, you fall in love with, I don't know, whatever it is, intramural softball, hiking. It doesn't matter. It doesn't need to be lifting weights or anything that you actually go to a big box gym for. But we need to find your thing. Because for me, this doesn't take any discipline. Favorite part
Mm.
of my day is lifting weights. And I get these side benefits of being healthy and defending a better body composition than I would otherwise. So that's my answer to the kind of the weight loss maintenance thing. But the actual act of how do I make sure that when I lose weight, it is primarily body fat and I'm maintaining or gaining muscle, or how do I put on muscle while minimizing body fat? That is stuff that I love. I've written a ton about it. I've got books on it. I've published open access research articles. And it's essentially a matter of don't make the surplus too big. Make sure you're doing
Mm.
progressive resistance training, eating enough protein, and not on a super low carb diet. And on when you're going the other direction, maybe kick your protein up a little more. Don't lose too fast, and make sure that you're not going on a too low of anything diet, and you have a decent amount of nutrients to cover any potential shortfalls that might come from being in a deficit. And give yourself enough time. And if that is a temporary loss of weight, the fact that you are hungry and that it's challenging, that's fine, because when it's over, you can regain the weight. If not, then you need to be thinking about, okay, how do I change my environment? And I think one thing that athletes need to consider, especially those who compete in very lightweight classes that require them to be very lean, is that sometimes you can find yourself cutting to a weight class that requires a high level of restraint, and that you can get in these very cyclical negative patterns, to where to be within striking distance of your weight class, you can't really progress. So you've kind of traded in this short-term improvement in performance,
Mm.
like, oh, look at my Sinclair, it's way better, but a lack of ability to progress long term. And instead of just going, all right, my off season, quote unquote, or where I hang around most of the time, needs to be in a place that is sustainable, doesn't require my mental faculties, which I actually need to put into this hour and a half session of snatches, because that takes a lot of mental energy in and of itself, and focusing on getting stronger. I need to stop trying to game the system and be light enough so that my current strength levels appear strong and actually get strong. Um, and I think that is a challenge, and it's easy to get wrapped up in that when, especially if you're good enough to where, oh, I can qualify for nationals and place in the top 10 if I just cut down a weight class. And I think that is something that is probably not taken with the appropriate amount of gravity, to realize, like, we
Mm.
need to really assess, like, all right, you're 6 foot and you want to compete in the 81 kilo class. Like, you can get there, you can do it. You should probably be in a bodybuilding stage if you're that lean. Is that a place that we can compete in? Like, are we just gonna do this once? Because how do you plan to keep on losing 15 kilos every year to compete?
Mm.
And if we have to hang out at 86 and you can just barely kind of white knuckle it and hold on, how do you plan to get stronger? How do you plan to maintain like a relationship with your significant other or keep your job? You know, and I think that's something that I see a lot of athletes, the ones who typically come away from their sport with a poor relationship with food and their body. It's because they were living that life
Mm.
of white knuckling it and trying to be competitive in a weight class when they probably needed to move up and just get stronger.
Yeah, and to reiterate your points, I had some like medical thing happen a few months ago. It seemed like forever ago now, but um, kind of on the comeback trail. I think I ended up hitting like an all-time squat PR. I hit 165 for 10, and people were like, "That's so motivating. How do you manage to do that?" And it's like I could not do anything else but lift weights. Like for me, that's I mean, that's why I chose it as a career, and that's why I put so much time and effort into it. But I just there's absolutely nothing else I'd want to do more than lift. So I don't think I'm motivational. I don't know how I could seem that way, but I guess for some people it helps. Now we obviously deal with people who have lives and significant others and can't necessarily control their environment as much as they'd like. So, if we're talking about weight loss and maximizing performance, we're also talking about this in the context of them living with a kid and a spouse.
Mhm.
And the spouse might not want to be a part of the like health craze if that's what they perceive it as, or these drastic changes. What does creating the right environment for weight loss or to change body composition look like in a way that's not only useful today but useful tomorrow?
Yeah. I think, yeah, I mean, you can find many ways of people integrating weight loss phases into their lives. And, if it is something that is going to be phasic, like, all right, we do this when it comes time for me to do my state my state champs and the nationals every year, 2 or 3 comps. And it's going to last 6 weeks. It's good to have a conversation with the people around you,
Mm.
let them know it's coming, so they know what's going on there. But also to have a very stable system, and you can do it with getting on the food scale, tracking macros, hitting numbers, and you can make that a lot less painful than it used to be, depending on the technology available and scanning foods and the ease of finding, very like consistent food sources that you like. And that's kind of how I roll with it. So like when I diet down for a bodybuilding show, we go, all right, so for the next 6 to 8 months, I'm going to be, making sure I can track my food, et cetera. And I will have some days where I can eat more, but I'm going to be generally aware of my calorie intake, and I'm going to be tracking my scale weight change, and monitoring my body composition and monitoring my performance. That said, if this is something that you plan to do multiple times, you want it to be as integrated into your life as possible. And kind of my philosophy, which doesn't give people any practical answers, but it helps them to know what they're aiming for, is that I don't want the people around me to know that I'm dieting until they start to see that my face looks leaner, or that I'm, like, are you okay, bro? That's which invariably happens in bodybuilding. Shouldn't be happening in weightlifting. You shouldn't be getting that lean if you can at all help it. Um, so what that means is that my philosophy is, all right, how do I handle this all myself? Um, it's understandable and it does happen, but you should definitely get away from it being like this. That early on, everyone has to change around you. You're changing your environment, which I did talk about is important for permanent weight loss, but for these temporary weight loss phases and making weight for competitions, it's like, honey, don't bring home pizza. How dare you? Like, how could you do that to me? Like, I'm trying to make weight so that I can get a plastic trophy. Um, like, I think that mentality is ultimately very unfair, and I think you need to realize that you have the privilege to choose to be in semi-starvation, where there's other people who do not have that choice but are in the same position, not by choice. So, you need to respect the people around you is kind of my philosophy. So that means, um, sitting down and having a conversation and going, so there are some things I just can't do. Like, I can't regularly go out to eat, and still kind of have a good gauge of where I'm at. And if we do go out to eat, can we maybe go to like a food court or a place that has a lot of
Mm.
options? Like, I probably just can't go to pizza, regularly, because there's no like high protein, low fat option for me that, hey, you can eat whatever you want, I can eat whatever I want. Really, we can't do that. So I think at the very least you have to acknowledge that there will be like some sacrifices made. Um, and I find the more tools you have in your tool belt, the better. So, for example, like I said, I prefer to be able to track, look at things, estimate their calories, estimate their macros, and try to hit some certain numbers and ranges, which is great. But I think the broader those ranges are, while still reaching your goal, like having a minimum threshold for protein, a mix of carbohydrates and fat, and having a target rate of weight loss, and maybe being able to do that qualitatively, so you don't have to bring a scale with you all over the place all the time. That does take some experience and skill, being able to look at things and gauge their energy counts is great. But like, if someone wants to go out to eat, or if we want to do something, you also have to have the ability to adjust. Like, all right,
Mm.
I'm normally used to cooking, weighing, and putting my food on a plate. We're going to go out to eat tonight. I'm going to make a choice at the restaurant, estimate, and I need to be comfortable with that and okay with that. Um, so I think there needs to be some discussion with the people who your decisions are going to affect, and then
Mm.
figure out what they're okay with and what they can live with. And then from there, you can adapt your methods to going, right. So here's how I can, not negatively affect the people around me. So, just for some insight into what that looks like for me, is I'm happy to eat out 2 to 3 times a week while I'm dieting. And so long as we can go to a place where I can make the right choices. And if, we can be spontaneous, but I prefer to know in advance. That way I can just think about what I'm going to do with my other meals. And I normally use a refeed schedule, which is absolutely not necessary, may not even be better, but certainly adapts itself well to when you have these meals out where you're not controlling your own food intake. And then I kind of cross-reference that with how much weight I'm losing on average over a 2 to 3 week period, and I can make adjustments as needed. Um, so that is kind of that process. But essentially, getting the weight loss done in as systematic a way as possible with the least amount of rigidity is the ideal approach.
Do you get super granular with things like meal timing, things like food quality, things like um cycling, high carb and low carb refeeds, diet breaks, stuff like that? Because I mean, we've taken a very bird's eye view of it,
Hmm.
and you kind of in passing mentioned that one, you've written a lot about it, so if people want more detail, they can find that in the muscle and strength pyramid, and all the other resources that you have, podcasts, articles. um, but when you start to get into the weeds of what this could look like, the composition of it, um, do you have like this pie chart of where the focus would normally sit and how it's distributed, or is that something we should save for future conversation?
Well, I don't have a pie chart, but I do have a pyramid. Um, so yeah, like the kind of the order of priorities in terms of what will affect your body composition changes the most. Energy balance is far and away the biggest one, and the way that plays out in, well, I'll just give you the pyramid first. So it's energy balance on the bottom level, then macronutrients, then micronutrients, then anything related to the temporal distribution of nutrients, and then finally supplements for nutrition.
Mm,
So, to what is energy balance? It's not just the statement of yes, you need to be in a deficit. It plays out in like what's the rate of weight loss or the rate of weight gain that's appropriate. Because we know that you can eat all the protein you want in the world, but if you're losing 4 kilograms a week, you're going to be losing lean
mm,
mass in that process. So that's going to have a larger impact than your macronutrient distribution. And then, yeah, protein does have a significant impact on the quality of your weight loss. So that is, kind of next on the list, along with, fueling yourself and providing essential nutrients. And there's a primarily taken care of if you think about your protein, fats, and carbs. But then, yes, indeed, you do need to think about the nutrient quality to some degree, or having a good distribution of whole foods, not exclusively so. And that's where kind of micronutrients fall into it. And then there is some effect that is worth it thinking about, but it's not that hard to tick the box of when you think about the distribution of calories and
mm,
nutrients. Like the data we have right now would suggest that if you only have 2 protein servings a day, you might be leaving something on the table even if you were to consume sufficient protein, because there is not enough time, not enough number of times where you've increased protein synthesis per day, distributed it so you have amino acid availability. There may be some benefit to making sure that there is protein in and around training, which, again, is going to be probably taken care of in a lot of meals. But if you only have three, we've got this on some of the more recent intermittent fasting data, it probably needs to be around training, you know.
mm,
And we have data now on vegan diets, that yes, you can have a very minutia focused view of the protein quality scores of vegan versus animal based proteins, and be like, that means therefore they're not equivalent. Well, if you eat enough protein, if you have a
mm.
decent protein spread and you do everything else right, the data thus far would suggest there's no significant difference between the two. So there's if you tick other boxes, some other ticks don't matter. So it's really important to get things right in the proper order of priority. So once I've got someone who is losing or gaining weight at an appropriate rate, has an appropriate distribution of macronutrients, has a good balance of their food intakes, then I will start manipulating other things. But it also depends on whether the juice is worth the squeeze. So
Mm.
if it's someone who needs to drop, like 3 kilos to make weight for a weightlifting meet, I'm going to look for kind of the path of least resistance. Like, all right, how are you with tracking calories? Oh, I hate it. All right, let's just focus on increasing your fruit and vegetable intake. It might even go low carb for a bit. How do you do on that? And increase your protein intake. We'll get your activity up a little bit, but we're not going to do proper cardio. And let's see what happens. Do you start dropping weight?
Mm.
No? Okay. Well, let's make some bigger picture changes. Let's just Are you good just to not eat out for the next 4 weeks? Does that affect your home life? Where are some things we can do that are more habit or behavioral based that'll get you into that deficit that are low stress? Are you a single guy going to college, or are you someone who has a spouse and kids? Very different answers,
Mm,
right? Um, okay, what if you are a competitive bodybuilder who has to get to 10% body fat as a female, or 4% body fat as a male, for example. Now I'm willing to cross a lot more T's and dot a lot more I's. Now it's worth considering taking a diet break every few months as a way to hopefully manage your satiety, improve your adherence, get your willpower back in order. Maybe we have a cyclical refeed strategy where we time that with your training, where we think that might help you maintain a little more muscle mass, and also gives us information about how I would carb load you on game day. You know, so I normally will take the minutia further based on the extremity of the goal. And
mm,
there's a big difference between weight class restricted strength sport, competitive bodybuilding, and someone who is looking to change their lifestyle so they can walk around at a healthier body composition permanently. So I think you very much have to not just think about what's optimal and go with it, but rather what is the best tool for the job that's going to make them more likely to succeed. Because if you take the ball too far, even if it's more optimal on paper, you're actually creating more barriers for them to succeed,
mm.
and you're increasing the likelihood that they'll fail because you gave them too many quote unquote good things.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think everyone who has checked out your stuff knows that the base of the training pyramid is adherence, and I think that kind of could go with a nutrition pyramid as well. How well can they follow the plan or stick to the plan? And we get into the training weeds a lot. I think we have a lot of resources for good coaches, places to go if people are looking to kind of diversify their training. But with nutrition, I know you're an incredibly busy guy and you probably can't take on people. And I don't know if you'd even be interested, but do you have got people you would recommend? I know their apps are really popular. Where can people go if they want to start to change their body composition for a weightlifting meet, or maybe make some lifestyle changes and focus on improving um, something along those lines?
100%. Yeah. So I'm part of 3D Muscle Journey, and while we are primarily a like natural bodybuilding coaching service and information provider, we have a ton of powerlifters we work with, and the occasional weightlifter or other strength athlete. And we will do their nutrition for them for sure. I'm not actively taking clients at the moment, but I am the chief scientific officer and advisor to the rest of the team. We have 3 other coaches who are full-time coaches, and they have absolutely helped people and regularly help people make weight for competition and figure out how to dial in their nutrition to aid performance and find a better kind of resting place they need to be at. One thing I will say to kind of bring this home specifically for weightlifters, there's some things that we like to look at. We talked about body composition briefly, but
Mm,
ultimately what you care about as a weightlifter is your performance and your weight, and
mm,
trying to find a place where you're best at that. And for powerlifters, your Wilks score or your IPF points or your good lift points, whatever is appropriate for your federation. And for a weightlifter, your Sinclair score are very useful. If you want to know if you are successfully moving up a weight class and not doing so too quickly, because that's typically what happens. It's like a weightlifter decides, oh, I'm going up a weight class, and they somehow get there in a month. Like not the way to do it. You have to be comfortable being between these weight classes and slowly gaining muscle, or you're actually going to see like a lower Sinclair score as you go up.
mm,
Likewise, as you cut down, having it be like a multi-month process and being okay with doing a few comps where you're just a lighter version of the same weight class before you finally get there. Um, Taking the time so you can make sure you lose primarily body fat. A good way to gauge whether that process is successful is if your Sinclair score is improving,
mm,
because you may sometimes actually be getting stronger in your total, but your Sinclair score is going down if you're going up too quick. And
mhm,
likewise, your Sinclair score can go down or not change while you're losing weight because your performance is dropping that much as you cut a weight class. And you're seeing that, this isn't the greatest way to get there. Maybe you can get there, stabilize, then gain strength. But I would say you probably want to see your Sinclair score improving as you try to make that move from a weight class to weight class. That's one of the metrics I'd normally like to use and talk about. But it does take patience on the part of the lifter.
Mhm. Yeah. So you've already done so much as, and I guess I could drone on about your accolades, but you've already done so much in terms of contributing to the field, and also researching topics related to strength sports and then advising other students. What's next for Eric Helms? Just more of the same, or is there anything kind of unexpected going on in the near future?
I don't think anything too unexpected. I'm pretty, man, I'm a pretty non-diversified person. We'll put it that way. Like I'm, I study this, I write about it, I do it myself. It's what I enjoy. It's what I talk about. My business and my income is related to it. But I think within that realm, there's a lot of cool stuff going on. So I think some really interesting stuff that probably your listeners would be interested in is what some of my students are doing at AUT at the moment.
Mm.
So I have a student. His name is Kedrick Kwan, and he's getting into the meat of his PhD this year, and it's specifically looking at all the various methods that weight class restricted strength athletes use to cut weight. So we're talking
Mm.
about, do you sauna the night before or the morning of? How does that affect sleep? Like how does being on a low fiber diet impact the amount of weight loss? How does that, if you combine these methods with water loading and water cutting, or even potentially getting into some of the more strange methods like spitting in a cup until you actually make weight. So there's a lot of different cool projects going on right now. I would say that my kind of career is in a point where me being the person in front and leading the charge per se is happening a little bit less, which I'm really appreciative of because it gives me the opportunity to try to pay it forward, pass the baton per se, and try to give what I can to the next generation. So I've got right now like 9 students between master's, PhD, and even some honors projects at AUT who are all doing really cool research that is relevant to the space. Um, and I'm still contributing to Mass. I've got articles and videos that come out every month. We've got our anniversary sale coming up, which is pretty cool. For if you really want to nerd out with us, it's a good price to get the subscription at. And outside of that, me and Omar are still going to be doing our thing, and talking to people in the broader weightlifting community. And I mean that like not weightlifting, but weight lifting.
Mhm.
General lifting, including weightlifters, of course. And then finally, I'm still on the 3D Muscle Journey podcast. If you want to get that real diet life perspective from the natural bodybuilding crew, and putting out blog posts there, and trying to be active on Instagram to share all that stuff that I'm doing. But that's pretty much it. And personally, I've got powerlifting meets coming up this year that I'm competing in. I'm doing nationals in August. I just did a comp a couple weeks back, and yeah.
Yeah, I did see that you did that powerlifting competition and through some adversity did incredibly well.
Thank you.
So that must have been a nice surprise.
It was, man. It was cool to hit a lifetime PR on deadlifts in not great conditions, and I'm very excited for the future. I think I've got a lot more kilos left to add to my total this year. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think the last question, and something people might be thinking, I know I am, how do you manage everything that's going on that you're seemingly contributing to, or managing yourself, um, with the same amount of time we all have in a day, in a week, in a month, in a year?
Not always well is the short answer. The longer answer is that despite what it may look like, I've been trying to consolidate and consolidate and
Mm,
consolidate more and more and more in the last 3 years. And since the completion of my PhD, you would think, which was in 2017, that all of a sudden I'd have more time. But I managed to immediately just fill the missing time with a bunch of other stuff, which I think was kind of a mistake. But at this stage, I've been on a relatively strict policy of saying no to anything new,
mm,
and just trying to really focus on the things that I've already said yes to give them my full efforts. But it is a constant challenge. I am a people pleaser. I'm a collaborator, and I'm someone who's trying to make a difference. And I'm also a workaholic. So those all combine to me doing too much generally. But yeah, I think I'm slowly getting better. But I also do prioritize my sleep, my training, and my personal relationships above everything else. And then I fit
mm.
in all the rest into the other cracks. And when I can't give enough effort to something, still keeping that prioritization, that's when I know I need to cut something loose.
Yeah, a few good resources for people who have made it this far in the episode. We mentioned a lot about habits. I did a podcast with Mel Davis of RP Strength, and fantastic show about habit formation. He also mentioned his PhD, and we did a podcast with Adam Story, who again mentioned that I should get Eric on to talk about body composition. So I would check out those two podcasts specifically. And then Eric, yeah, again, he's done all these books and articles and other podcasts, Iron Culture. Uh, there's almost an unlimited amount of information that you can consume if you're interested in more of what we talked about. Eric, I did mention the Muscle and Strength Pyramid and the Iron Culture podcast. You mentioned 3DMJ. Where else can we direct people who want to check out more?
Man, I very much appreciate you plugging all that. And the only other thing I'd say is if someone is interested in staying up to date with the most relevant research for strength athletes on a regular basis, you might want to check out Monthly Applications in Strength Sport, which I do alongside Eric Trexler, who you already mentioned, Dr. Eric Trexler, as well as Greg Knuckles and Dr. Mike Zerdos. And we write about, about 100 pages every month that comes out in our issues. We cover 8 recent articles, and myself and Dr. Zerdos do a video each month as well on a more broader topic in video format. And we have audio roundtables discussing them for people who don't have the time to read it all. We have a Facebook group to talk, people who have even more time and to engage with the research with one another. And you can also, if you're a trainer, we have CEUs and CEC quizzes available based on our content, which you can use to renew your NASM, NSCA, ACE, or ACSM certifications.
Yeah, and uh, I'm probably droning on far too much, so I will wrap up the podcast. Eric, once again, thanks for coming on. I think I always tell you this, but my interest in lifting weights was heavily bolstered by the work you did with Matt Ogus, and then Chris Jones. I have to throw his name in there, and all of those guys back in the old school YouTube scene. Hopefully now this is some content that gets people motivated to train and to kind of get their nutrition in order so they can improve their body composition and lift bigger weights and have a higher body weight per weight lifted score. And if you guys enjoyed the episode, you can leave us a like, a comment, you can share it with your friends and family, and we will catch you next week on another episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast.